I'm Jen Rose. Welcome to the Teachers Playlist podcast, where I bring outstanding educators to the mic to share their insight and capacity, and in doing so, create a playlist for educators who are seeking momentum and inspiration, as all of us are at this moment. I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Tom Guskey to this forum. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks,
Dr.
Jen.
Thomas Guskey is a senior research scholar at the University of Louisville and a professor at the College of Education at the University of Kentucky. I promised I would get through your biography first. I've shortened it a great deal because we only have, 20 minutes, Tom. I just wanted to highlight how amazing you are. He's the author and editor of 24 award-winning books, 24. And more than 250 chapters and articles. My life goal is to do one blog post, Tom. So, oh my goodness. And the book that has become one of my main squeezes is loving it, is Implementing Mastery Learning. And what we know about grading, what works, what doesn't, and what's next. I have that on Kindle. And I recommend both books highly to all BC educators. I'm going to put the links in the video description. I'm more confident for having read it. And the demand for research-based programs anyway is really being revived right now, particularly in discussions about reading and mathematics. So why wouldn't grading stand up to the same, sort of demand for research? So we're going to deviate just slightly from asking Tom what his greatest hit is, because clearly there are several. And we're going to lean on him today for the fascinating information. I'm so excited about Benjamin Bloom offered in Implementing Mastery Learning. I just feel like my colleagues will benefit as much as I have from knowing about the incredible impact that Bloom has had on our educational landscape, especially because right now it's filled with so many catchphrases and slogans that we all have to sit through. So Tom, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Well, thanks, Jen. It's really an honor to be with you today. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to get into the questions. And in doing so, the backdrop are the two books that I mentioned. Again, the link is in the video description. I highly recommend you read these. And there's some burning questions that BC educators have. So I'm sort of taking this from discussions I have around the province when I offer Pro-D, and honestly, staff room conversations, because those are very interesting. And the question that comes up a lot pertains directly to your book, Tom. What we know about grading, what works, what doesn't. A persistent issue that arises when we're discussing the design of the BC curriculum, the separation specifically of what we call curricular competencies and content, is characterized usually by one of two claims. So we sometimes, we debate it. We don't teach content anymore is one way of looking at it. We teach transferable skill sets. So we're changing now. And that's why in our curriculum, you can see a distinction between curricular competencies and content. Or one of the other claims is that we don't report or assess understanding of content anymore. We are only assessing gradations of quality, of performance and competencies. So there's a lot of confusion, and I think it's undermining our ability to effectively apply standards-based assessment. That's my opinion, and the feedback that I have. So I'm wondering if you could offer, Tom, some insight into the relationship between content and process goals and how that might be applicable to BC educators.
Okay. I should start by explaining from whence my perspective comes. My advisor, the chair of my doctoral dissertation, was Benjamin Bloom. Now, this is the same Benjamin Bloom that developed Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives as cognitive domain. So having studied with him, a lot of my perspectives on this are formulated because of that work. Now, I clearly worked with him many years after his work in the taxonomy, but still that prevailed and was a part of what we learned in working with him, especially in the areas of curriculum development. What's important to keep in mind too is that Bloom's mentor, his advisor, was a fellow by the name of Ralph Tyler. And in 1949, Ralph Tyler published a book entitled Basic Principles of Curriculum and Instruction. In his book, Tyler suggests that before you can teach anyone anything, there are two fundamental decisions you have to address. The first is, what do you want them to learn and be able to do? And the second is, what evidence would you accept to verify they learned those things? And that foundational information is the basis of everything we do today in terms of a standards-based approach or a competency-based approach or an outcomes-based approach or whatever name you clear to attach to it. But it was that influence on Bloom that then led him in his work in curriculum development to really start with that foundation. And what Bloom found is that when we asked teachers what they wanted the students to learn and be able to do, that they varied widely in what they were suggesting. And Bloom came to this in actually the late 1940s. He was at that time what was called the University Examiner. In the 1940s and early 1950s, this was following the Second World War. Universities throughout North America were growing very rapidly. The soldiers were returning from the war, and in the United States, we had what was called the GI Bill, which provided funding for these new returning men and women to go to college and earn college degrees. And so universities were growing rapidly. There was some concern about there being some consistency in the way they were going to be evaluated in their performance. In many universities, they were teaching like 30 sections of English 101 and 25 sections of Biology 101. So to provide this consistency, most universities established what they called an Office of the University Examiner. And these examiners led a team that would meet with the faculty in different departments and help them to develop a course exam. Well, as Bloom was doing this at the University of Chicago, he found that faculty members had very different perspectives with regard to how they were going to assess student learning. The biology department, for example, prepared over 600 questions that they felt would be appropriate to use on a final examination. The philosophy department prepared 2. And so they saw these great differences between it. And as they were looking at it, they found that the cognitive complexity of the questions varied drastically.
Yes.
So Bloom decided to get these university examiners together. They began meeting first at the American Psychological Association conference to talk about these problems. And then they began work, a group of them, to develop a way that they could organize the cognitive complexity of the skills we wanted students to develop in relation to any content.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And so they came up with their first version in 1954, had it reviewed, and finally were able to get it published in 1956. They called it the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, the Cognitive Domain.
Okay.
And in this taxonomy, they specify very clearly that content and process cannot be separated, period.
Well, okay. Thank you. Okay.
And the reason is that
Okay.
you cannot think without substance, and to have substance alone isn't enough to think about it, right? And so this taxonomy developed was organized in terms of the cognitive complexity of those particular learning goals. The first
Right.
level was knowledge,
Right.
and that was just typically what people put in the content.
Yes. Right.
You know, these are the things we think are important for you to learn.
Right.
And so if I ask a question about content, it would just be giving the information back to me in pretty much the same way I gave it to you. Do
Okay.
you remember it? Can you
Yes.
recall it?
Recall. Right.
The second level was a little bit more complicated, and it was what they labeled comprehension.
Okay.
And comprehension meant, can you explain it in your own words?
Right.
Can you recognize appropriate examples of it? Can you see illustrations of it? Slightly more complex than that was what they called application. An application we refer to also as transfer. And this
Okay.
is being able to take that content and apply it or use it or transfer it to new and different contexts. So instead of just recognizing, you had to come up with your own. You had to see how it would be applied in different contexts.
Okay.
Slightly more complex than that is what they
Right.
call analysis.
Right.
Analysis deals with like compare and contrast. How are these the same? How are they different? Can you really understand the complexities of it to be able to identify same and differences, to pull things apart? A next level was what they called synthesis. And synthesis was combining things in new and unique ways. Do you see how what you're learning in math has applications to biology or chemistry? Or
Right.
how what we're working on in reading has applications for what we know about social studies, and you can use these skills in those areas. And finally was the area of evaluation. And evaluation dealt with thinking about the extension of those ideas, the moral implications of it. You know, was it valuable to learn these things or not? And what made it valuable? And why are some things more valuable to learn than others? But when they developed this original work, they developed in this description what they called content by behavior matrices.
Okay.
And so you would take the content and then
Yeah.
you would express this content in these 6 different taxonomic levels of
Okay.
things that students would do with that content.
Right.
They recognize that you can't have thinking skills without something to think about.
Right.
You had to think about it with regard to some certain content, but
Mhm.
just knowing the content wasn't enough, that we wanted them to use it in different ways. Now, as they developed this, they also recognized that although it was a taxonomy of cognitive complexity, it did not necessarily imply difficulty.
Right. Okay. Because that
I mean,
is different.
generally,
Okay.
generally the higher level skills
Right.
are more difficult to teach and more difficult to learn.
Yes.
But that's not always the case. I mean, for example, if I posed a very complex word problem dealing with subtraction,
Hmm.
I think that all of our listeners would probably be able to answer it correctly.
Okay.
But if I said, in a subtraction problem, can you tell me which term is the subtrahend and which is the minuend?
Hmm.
It might be more difficult.
Hmm.
The idea is that very minute content information can be extremely difficult
Yes.
for people to remember, but
Okay.
it's not necessarily a necessary prerequisite for being able to apply that in a new different context.
Okay. All right. I see.
But what's amazing is that although this was published in 1956,
Yeah.
from 1956 to 1966, the first 10 years that it was out,
Hmm.
they originally published 5,000 copies. It did not sell those 5,000 copies. From 1966 to 1976, it sold over 1 million copies. It
Okay.
became one of the very first million sellers in education because it became the foundation for curriculum development throughout the world. Everybody saw this as a way of being able to combine and integrate content with the
Okay.
cognitive behaviors that were associated with it. And so
Okay.
we put those things together, and that
Yes.
became the foundation of all the curriculum development nations throughout the world.
So is there a design sort of reason for separating content and competencies, or do you see any kind of design advantage to that?
Well, according to Bloom and his colleagues,
Yep.
and emphasized again today,
Yep.
they argued, in fact, Bloom always referred to the taxonomy as the most widely cited, least read book in all of education. Because people took the notions and they had these lists of verbs you attach to these different categories of
Yes.
taxonomy,
Yes.
but they never really read it.
No.
And if you go back and you read that taxonomy in the introduction, they talk in great detail about why content and behavior or process cannot be separated within a curriculum.
No.
That you cannot have thinking skills without thinking about something. And other very prominent people in our field, Howard Gardner, for example, is noted for saying to think outside the box, you must first have the box, which makes good sense. I mean, you have to be
Yes.
thinking about something. And granted, having great content knowledge does not necessarily mean you can apply it into a different context.
No.
It's a different, it's a different learning skill.
Yeah.
But there needs to be some foundation upon which we can build.
That's beautifully said. Thank you so much, Tom. That's great. I'm going to be citing many of those little tidbits. I have to go back in the video and, and in our discussion and take out little tidbits. So thank you so very much. I also wanted to ask another burning question, because something else that comes up a lot in staff room discussions and just between colleagues What skills in assessment would be suggested as the most important for pre-service teachers to acquire? And I wanted to lean on you because you're speaking as a researcher and a scholar. If you could recommend that, what would you recommend? Actually, I should ask you very quickly. This is another additional question. Have you worked with pre-service teachers? Do you run any programs that educate pre-service teachers?
Well, unfortunately, I work at a major research university,
Yes.
and because of that,
Mhm.
uh, we are like other major research universities in that we do, in my department, I'm the department in which I'm a faculty member is one of 8 departments in our College of Education. My department is called the Department of Educational, School, and Counseling Psychology.
Okay.
And I am an educational psychologist by training, but my background is primarily in educational measurement and evaluation. That's just where we're located in the college. Uh, However, we do teach one undergraduate course. It's the sort of basic undergrad ed psych class.
Okay.
However, we have one faculty member who's an advisor to a whole team of TAs, teaching assistants, that teach the
Okay.
course. So to get to me at my university, you have to be a graduate student. In all my years of teaching at the university, I have not taught a single undergraduate class in education. Um, all my teaching has been with graduate students. But that's the same at Harvard University, at Stanford University, at all other major research universities. And there are some exceptions. I mean, for example, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, they assigned their best professor to teach entering freshman level classes, which I think is absolutely brilliant. I mean, to begin with exposure to these wonderful minds,
Oh,
they're making remarkable contributions to the field. But that wisdom and that sensibility hasn't necessarily been transmitted to other major research universities.
okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, we all wish that you were more, like, what are you doing next year? Are you busy? Like, we need some help, Tom.
Yeah.
Um, So getting back to the point, speaking as a researcher and a scholar, what skills and assessment would you suggest are the most important, the crucial skill sets for pre-service teachers to acquire?
Once again, and again, this comes from um, my influence or what has
Mhm.
influenced me
Yeah.
for it all, and that was the brilliant people with whom I've worked in
Mhm.
my own education. I would recommend that people go back and read the work of Benjamin Bloom, not from the 50s, but from the 70s, when
Okay.
he was focusing on the idea of mastery learning.
Yes.
Bloom was the one who brought to our field the idea that we need to use assessments as learning tools, as a part of the instructional process, rather than simply evaluation devices that occur at the end. It was Bloom who brought the word formative assessment to education.
So,
He was the first to do this, even though, and I did this recently, I was able to identify 64 books that are available to educators today with the topic formative in the title.
yes.
And I thought, well, if you're writing a book with formative in the title, you should know where the term came from.
Yes.
And
And
where it actually came from was in 1967. Again, we sort of ignore this history, but in
yes, we do.
1967, before many of us were even born, Michael Scriven was working in the area of program evaluation. And he made this
Right.
observation that in program evaluation, typically people wait until the end to gather any information about whether it worked or not.
Okay.
And Scriven thought that was missing a great deal, and he recommended that evaluators should collect information as the program was being implemented. The information would be given back to the program developer as so they could make changes while implementation was in progress and then be able to get better results at the end. To distinguish that kind of information you'd gather in process,
Yes.
he turned the term used the terms formative and summative evaluation in 1967.
O-
Now,
Okay. Is he
Benjamin
cited? Is
Bloom,
he cited in all these books that
yeah,
mention?
Yeah. Benjamin
Oh,
Bloom and Michael Scriven were very good friends. And they were talking about this, and Bloom said, that's a great idea. We need to do this in education. And so it was in 1968, the following year,
right.
that Benjamin Bloom published his work called Learning for Mastery, where he suggested doing the same in education, using classroom assessments, gathering information along the way as learning tools. And it was from him that the word formative applied to education actually came. So anyway, from the 67 books, how many would you guess that have formative in the title actually cited Michael Scriven or Benjamin Bloom? Now remember, I mean, this is where like 1967,
Okay.
1968. So
So
we're talking over 50 years.
I'm going to ask a parallel question.
Mhm,
Um, the term assessment for learning was
mhm.
another one. So that also is Michael Scriven, yes? Is that
Well, no, actually, they never talked about these particular prepositions. Uh,
okay?
and it was the assessment for learning
Yes.
was Rick Stiggins' take on
Oh,
Benjamin Bloom's work on mastery learning.
okay, because that came up in, within the last decade, I think, as being somebody's
Yeah,
term
it
that they
goes back a
came up
little
with.
bit earlier than that. It was in the 1980s, 1990s that
Okay,
that
because
Stiggins came up with the
okay,
idea of
so the
assessment
question is
for learning instead of assessment
how
of learning.
many have cited out of the 60, you said 67 books?
Five,
65?
only five of 67 books that have formative in the title cite either Michael Scriven or Benjamin Bloom, who came up with the term.
So why do
To
you think
me,
that is, Tom?
well, I think that it's a real sadness because it shows that people writing about these ideas haven't taken the time to understand the history, the development of it, and to go back and read that brilliant work of Bloom and others at that time. And Bloom talked about the notion of using these assessments to gather information about what students have learned and not learned. And he suggested that it needs to be both diagnostic and prescriptive. That the diagnostic aspect was that assessments should communicate to students what they were expected to learn and what they were expected to do.
Right?
Second, among those things, what have they done really well?
Hmm.
And third, among those things, what have they not done well enough yet?
Yes.
But Bloom also recognized that by itself, that information really isn't going to help them improve learning. That to improve, that diagnostic aspect needed to be combined with a prescriptive
Yes.
aspect, which Bloom called correctives. And
Yes. I
that's
love
guidance
correctives. Yes.
and direction to the students as to how they
Yes.
can improve. And again, where Bloom stressed, and again, this is back in stuff that he wrote in 1960 to 1971, where people still today are confusing it because they don't know this history.
No.
Bloom said this is not reteaching, that going back and repeating a process you already know hasn't worked is not going to yield any better results the second time around.
In your words, it's not just saying it slower and louder, more slowly.
Exactly.
Louder. I
Exactly.
love that. I laughed out loud at that. That's true. Yes.
But he said what we're saying is these kids can learn, just maybe they learn differently. And
Right.
so it's incumbent upon us as teachers to present it
Differentiation.
in a different way,
Yes.
engage students in learning in different ways. We
Yes.
teach as we learn best. And that works for a lot of kids, but it doesn't work for others.
No.
And so there's no one set of like best practices. It's teachers have to develop a repertoire of practices because they deal with the diversity of learners in their room.
Yes. So would you recommend, I'm sure as recommended reading, implementing mastery learning? I would feel like that would be a really good read.
Well, I'm personally biased in this way, of course,
Well,
given that I wrote
it is
Implementing
your
Mastery.
podcast guest time, so like
Yeah.
you're kind of
And
allowed to be. So
actually, what was challenging about this, though, Jen, was then when I developed the first issue, Benjamin Bloom is still alive. And I asked him, and he graciously accepted to write the foreword to the book. So in the first two editions of Implementing Mastery Learning, we had the foreword written by Benjamin Bloom,
yes.
where he really reflected on my ideas about the application of these ideas. And he had passed away when we did this third edition just last year. So the publisher, instead of including that forward, asked me to write a prologue.
I
The
saw
challenge
that.
was
Yeah.
going back and trying to understand what education was like back in 1968, the context in which he wrote this. And it was really fascinating to understand what was going on. And in the 1968, I mean, what was happening? I mean, this was the height of the war in Vietnam. There
Oh,
were
okay.
college protests
Yes.
throughout the height of the civil rights movement, and there were many protests about that. Um, and so all these things were going on. You know, the Kennedy assassination had taken place before that. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. There was all this social turmoil, and then not only that, there was a report that was published in 1966 called "Equality of Educational Opportunity." And it was a huge report funded by the federal government of the United States trying to find out if the federal government was going to have a role in education, how could they best
Right.
invest the money? And the lead author on that report was James Coleman. And basically what the report said is educators don't make much difference. That if you understand or can measure the social demographic and economic characteristics from which students come, you
Right.
can predict with pretty good accuracy how well they're going to learn in school. Um, but what most people did not read was the one dissenting opinion in that report, written by Benjamin Bloom.
Yeah, that is part of the prologue, I think. Right? Do you
Yeah.
have that in? I'm sure I read that. Yes.
And what Bloom said is
Okay.
everything we're telling you in this report is correct,
Yes.
given all the data we have.
Yes.
But he said, here's what I think is happening, that we have a balance. And on one side of the balance, we have these social, demographic, and economic characteristics of students.
Yes.
And the other side of the balance, we have the quality of our instruction.
Yes.
Now, when the quality of instruction is not very good, these things look very powerful.
Yes, they
You
do.
can predict, we can predict education outcomes with amazing accuracy.
Yes.
But he believed that if we work on this side, if
Yeah.
we improve the quality of instruction and make it more applicable for the learning needs of individual students, the balance would flip.
Yes.
And he believed, in fact, his address as president of the American Education Research Association was called The Vanishing Point.
I love the vanishing point too, folks. It explains that in this book. It's
Yeah,
amazing.
because
I was
basically, yeah, he said that if we do this, the influence of those things will vanish.
Is that
That
is this similar, Tom? You know, you've probably seen this on, social media, etc. Equity grading, that's been revived as well. Grading
mm,
for equitable grading practices. Is that I've never heard Benjamin Bloom cited in any of those either. Is that really stemming from what he was talking about with equitable practice?
well, um, how can I say this in a way that would be politically correct? Um,
Just say
no,
it.
it's not cited in that way. But
No.
again, it's the idea
Yes.
uh, that in grading, teachers include a variety of uh, indicators, many of which do not reflect student learning.
Yes.
Um, we have practices like, for a day late, a grade lower.
Oh, yes.
Punctuality and turning in assignments is part of the grade.
Yep.
Uh, and all these different things. And what the idea behind grading for equity is, and it actually stems back to what I wrote about back in the 1990s,
Mhm.
and that was that we need to start giving multiple grades. We need to
Yes, I
pull out these
agree.
non-achievement factors. Now, where people are
Yes.
getting confused is that many school districts, and again, it's being advocated by some of the equity grading folks, you pull those things out, which is great, but you can't just neglect them.
Okay, and that is interesting that I read an article where you talked about a dashboard. It would be nice to have a dashboard
Mm.
of skill sets and be very clear on what are we reporting on, if it's work
Right.
habits and those things, that is separate, but you don't just drop it off completely. I agree. Yeah, and that's why I wanted you to sort of touch on that, because it sounds familiar, the equity grading
Right.
and how that might reflect what you're talking about. Um, Curious, and I know you can do this beautifully and succinctly. In what ways, and this is what I was so blown away by, is Benjamin Bloom's mastery learning, and you've touched on it already, the progenitor of many of today's instructional practices. We hear competency-based learning. I thought that just came out in, 2003. That's me. I just thought, oh, this is brand new. That sounds really exciting and very highbrow. This is great. Personalized learning, differentiated instruction. So And that all can be traced back to Benjamin Bloom's mastery learning. So could you go through that with us a little bit?
Sure. And you're right. It all basically goes back to Bloom's ideas. One of the things that we are very good at in education is that when something doesn't seem to be working very well, we never change it substantively. We just change the name. And so we have all these names for the same things, basically. Um, and I often tell the story about being in a school where I was asked to work with a curriculum development committee that was struggling terribly. And so I sat with them in the morning, and one of the things for which they had great difficulty was distinguishing between learning goals and learning objectives. And they went back and forth, arguing passionately about the difference between these things. And I got very frustrated. And so at one point, I pulled out a piece of paper and I wrote a statement on my paper. And I said, the student will be able to,
Okay.
which is how I begin my statement. And then I pulled a verb out of Bloom's taxonomy, a good
Yeah.
high level verb, a verb like
Okay.
transfer. Right?
Okay.
And I text them into it. And I handed it out to the group. And I say, ladies and gentlemen, this is a simple multiple choice question.
Okay.
I would like you to read this question. And would you tell me, please, is this a goal, a standard, an outcome, a proficiency, a target, right? An objective, or a New Year's resolution? And they spent the next hour arguing about that. But then here's what I did.
Okay.
We broke for lunch and I walked down the hall. We were working in the high school that day. I walked into the cafeteria and I showed my statement to 10 different high school students and asked them the same question. And unlike their teachers and school leaders who had difficulty reaching consensus,
Yeah.
every student I asked gave me the same answer. You know what they said?
What?
Who cares? Right? And they were right. I mean, who cares? It
Kind of.
doesn't matter what you call it.
No.
The
I know.
idea goes back to what Tyler told us in 1949.
Yes.
What do you want students to learn to be able to do?
Yes.
What evidence would you accept to verify they can do it? All right. And
So,
and what you label those things doesn't really matter.
so multi-labeling is really a form of misunderstanding.
Well, it can be, especially when people get involved in arguments about trying to distinguish between the two. You know, it takes us off and uses energy in ways that are not going to be very productive at all.
No, no.
Let's focus on the core issues. The core issue is clarity, and bring that clarity to the curriculum. But what Bloom said early on, and I've written about this several times, is that if you think of learning in any subject area,
Mhm.
it is infinite. There's no limit to what you can learn in any subject area, but a curriculum is finite. When we
Okay,
define a
right.
curriculum, we specify within an entire domain the
Yes.
things we think are most important for students to learn to be able
important.
to do.
Yeah.
Now, once you define those, then our job becomes helping all students learn that excellently.
Okay.
Not just
Right.
some, but all. I mean, we would never put anything in curriculum we expected some students not to be able to learn. That just doesn't make sense. And so our challenge as educators, once we define a curriculum, knowing it's finite, is to do everything we can to have all learn it excellently. And that was the premise of Benjamin Bloom's work.
Which is really the, again, probably the claims of competency-based, personalized learning, differentiated instruction. Yes. Okay.
Mhm.
Finally, I'm so excited to ask you for this. Yay. And this is something that I'm really pleased to do for my fellow educators, is offer practical hands-on tools, and especially from really gifted educators
Mhm.
like yourself. Do you have a free share link that teachers can use in their practice, and how can they use it?
Um, well, I hope that they would find it useful to go to my website. It's just tguskey.com.
Okay.
And if you go there, you can um, look up articles. If you go and hit
Yes.
resources and articles, you'll see an entire collection of articles on assessment, another collection of
Beautiful.
articles on grading.
Beautiful.
There's a collection of articles on mastery learning, and finally a collection of articles on professional learning, professional development for educators. They're the four major areas where I've sort of focused. There's a section of reports there, and that deals with studies or interviews that have been done with college admissions officers,
Mhm.
asking what they're looking for in terms
Yeah.
of reports to determine both admission and the granting of financial assistance to students coming in.
Mhm.
Um, I write a regular blog for Education Week on different topics. You can find those there too. Other blogs written by Corwin and other publishers that are available to there. So the whole series of things. They're shorter and kind of right to the point about certain issues that might be important.
And they're
And
fantastic. I have two of them right next to me right now. And no, they're really good because they are short and to the point. And actually your writing is characterized by being concise, but it's so palatable. Like I love your writing. I really do. You're
oh,
stylistically, you're a beautiful writer, and I'm being quite serious about that. It's not very often that I come home from work and I don't turn on the TV. No, really though. And I didn't do that just for today. Look at that. I'm actually using different colored sticky notes. I've never even done that for this book. It's delicious. Like it's amazing. And I recommend it to all of my fellow educators, beginning and coming toward the end like I am. It's just really excellent work. And I'm so excited to share your link. Yes. Thank you so much, Tom. And I want to thank you just so much for agreeing to come and talk to me and to share your work and your knowledge.
Jen, thank you. It's really been a pleasure. And I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk about these really intriguing issues and hopefully offer some things that our listeners will find helpful as we go through this. If I can be at all helpful, I hope the one is taking in touch with me too. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tom. I hope you have a great day and we will see you hopefully very soon. Oh, and you have a new book. You just had a new book come out. I wanted to ask about that. What's your
But
newest book?
yeah, the most recent book I had come out is called Engaging Parents and Families in Grading Reform.
Okay, right. And that's my next read. But yes, and you probably have something on your website about that as well, hey, or the site that you're sharing with us.
Yes.
Okay.
Under resources, you can click on books and it shows all the books that are available too.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you again, Tom. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen. Take care now.